"This isn't that kind of hotel. You people know where to go." That was what Elliot Brandt said, standing tall behind the polished front desk of a luxury hotel he didn't own, but ruled like a gatekeeper. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that. To him, a black man walking in alone wasn't a guest. He was a problem to be removed. He didn't ask for ID, didn't check availability. Instead, his signature move was calling security. What Elliot didn't know was that the man he'd just thrown out wasn't looking for a room. He owned the building. His name was Malcolm King, CEO, founder, billionaire. Now, Malcolm isn't coming back to make a reservation. He's coming back to make a point about power and about the price of letting people like Elliot define who belongs and who doesn't. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Malcolm King sat alone in his corner office on the top floor of the King & Crest headquarters, surrounded by the quiet hum of wealth and precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind him like a portrait of the skyline, soft gray light bleeding in through sheer curtains, casting long shadows across polished walnut floors. The air smelled faintly of espresso and leather, calculated, subtle, luxurious. His phone buzzed with texts, emails chimed rhythmically in the background, and yet none of it held his attention. His eyes were locked on a tablet screen, brows drawn low, lips pressed in a straight, unreadable line. The report he was reading was thorough, brutally so. Declining guest satisfaction ratings, staff turnover numbers higher than usual, and 2 formal complaints filed within the past 3 months at one of his most prestigious locations downtown. Nothing catastrophic, not on paper. But Malcolm hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by ignoring whispers before they turned into headlines. It was one of his flagship hotels, and even the smallest blemish on its reputation reflected on the crown he wore. Unseen, unspoken, but always present. He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin, letting the silence stretch until he could almost hear his own thoughts pushing against the glass. He could have sent someone. He had regional directors, a senior hospitality team, even anonymous surveyors. But those routes were expected. They were filtered. Malcolm didn't want a report that passed through 5 layers of curated language and cautious phrasing. He wanted to see what guests saw, what staff saw. He wanted to step into the walls of his own creation and feel, firsthand, what had begun to rot. So, instead of calling for a driver or alerting the staff, he stood and walked toward the armoire tucked into the far corner of the room, sliding open its paneled doors with a quiet finality. The tailored suits, silk ties, and handmade dress shoes remained untouched. Instead, he reached for a soft navy hoodie, the one he rarely wore outside the gym, and pulled it over his undershirt. His slacks were replaced with dark jeans, clean but unimpressive. The Rolex came off, left resting in a dish by the sink. He picked up an old leather duffel from the closet shelf, one he used back in college, when he took buses instead of jets. When he looked in the mirror, he saw no trace of the man who'd been on the cover of Forbes or featured in late-night interviews discussing entrepreneurship, legacy, and generational wealth. He didn't look poor, but he didn't look rich either. He looked like a man passing through, comfortable enough to get by, but not important enough to be remembered. And that, he thought, was exactly the point. The drive downtown was quiet, just a hired lift, with a polite driver and smooth jazz humming through the speakers. Malcolm didn't make conversation. He watched the city roll past through streaked windows, the streets pulsing with mid-afternoon rhythm. Tourists dragging wheeled bags across pavement, business professionals tucked behind designer sunglasses, baristas leaning out of side doors on smoke breaks. The hotel rose into view like a sculpture carved from light and glass, its design modern, daring, unapologetically expensive. It had won awards. It had hosted diplomats and celebrities. Malcolm had walked through its doors dozens of times before, always flanked by staff who opened them with reverence and greeted him like visiting royalty. But not today. He stepped out onto the curb with nothing in his hand but the duffel, adjusted his hood against the wind, and walked toward the entrance like a stranger. The valet didn't spare him a glance. The doorman didn't move. No one offered assistance. He pulled open the heavy glass door himself and stepped into the chilled, perfumed air of the lobby, the marble beneath his feet shining like still water. Chandeliers glowed above, refracting soft light across glossy surfaces. The front desk curved like a smile just ahead, manned by two receptionists and a tall, square-shouldered man with a hotel name tag pinned above his breast pocket. Elliot Brandt, manager. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged, but whose presence no one recognized. And that, again, was exactly the point. As he approached the desk, he noticed the flicker in the manager's eyes. A brief scan, hoodie, duffel, no watch, no luggage cart, followed by the faintest downturn of the lips. Malcolm had seen it before. Not here, not recently. But he'd seen it, too many times to forget what it meant. He stopped at the counter, calmly setting his bag at his feet, and waited for acknowledgement. The manager looked at him, then looked away. One of the receptionists glanced up, uncertain, her smile faltering before the manager leaned over and murmured something low. She didn't respond. Malcolm said nothing. He merely waited, shoulders squared, gaze steady, every inch of him controlled. Because today, he wasn't the CEO. He was the test, and the hotel, the one he had built from the ground up, polished until it sparkled, staffed with the best of the best, was about to answer for itself. Malcolm approached the desk without slowing. He let the duffel drop gently at his feet, placed both hands calmly on the counter, and nodded once toward the nearest attendant. "Good afternoon," he said evenly, his tone smooth, practiced, carrying just enough warmth to soften the edge of authority beneath it. "I'd like to book a room. Just one night." The younger receptionist opened her mouth to respond, but the manager stepped forward first. "Sir," he said, with a flat smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "do you have a reservation?" Malcolm shook his head. "No, I was in the area and thought I'd stop in. Figured I'd stay the night here, treat myself." The manager's smile didn't fade, but it thinned. "We generally recommend guests book ahead, especially at this location. We're usually at capacity, and our rates aren't exactly casual." Malcolm offered a small, patient smile. "That's fine. I'm aware of the rates." "Yes, well," the manager replied, eyes flicking again to the duffel. "We've had a few walk-ins lately, and they've caused issues. People who don't quite understand the standards we maintain here." Malcolm felt the weight of the words before they finished landing. His posture didn't shift, and his smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "I'd still like to check if you have a room available." The receptionist glanced nervously toward the terminal, clearly uncertain whether she should intervene. But the manager raised a hand before she could speak. "We're fully booked," he said, staring directly at Malcolm. "There's a tech conference in town. Not a single suite available." "Funny," Malcolm said softly, "because I just checked your website 10 minutes ago. Multiple options still showing. Junior suites, executive level, even a penthouse." The manager's expression cooled. "The site isn't always in real time. Our internal system is what matters. And I'm telling you, there's nothing available." Malcolm leaned forward just slightly, voice still calm, but now wrapped in unmistakable steel. "Then, would you mind checking the system?" "I'll wait." Elliot didn't move. "I'm trying to be polite, sir. But if you can't afford a room here, that's perfectly fine. We're not here to make anyone feel ashamed for their situation. But we do ask that people respect our policies. Loitering in the lobby without a reservation isn't permitted." The word loitering landed like a slap disguised as a handshake, but Malcolm didn't blink. "I just told you I'm trying to make a reservation. And I told you we're booked." The manager's voice was louder now, pitched just enough to draw attention from the nearby lounge area. A couple seated on a velvet settee turned their heads. One of the bellhops at the far end of the lobby paused mid-step. "Now, if you'd like a list of more affordable accommodations, I'd be happy to point you towards something more suitable." "I didn't ask for a list of cheaper hotels," Malcolm replied, voice even, slow. "I asked if this one had a room." "I think we both know what's going on here," Elliot said, his tone shifting from condescension to calculated dismissal. "You don't need to pretend. It's obvious this place is a little out of reach. And frankly, we've had problems before with people coming in to warm up or use the restrooms without permission. It's nothing personal, isn't it?" Malcolm asked, his voice low but heavy now, like a distant roll of thunder. "Because I'd like to know what about me suggests I'm not the kind of person who belongs here." The manager exhaled, slow and dramatic, as if trying to signal patience. "Sir, with all due respect, our clientele is refined, professional. You walk in dressed like that, carrying a duffel bag, no luggage cart, no assistant, no driver, no suit, no tie, no whiteness," Malcolm said, finally letting the edge bleed into his tone. The manager stiffened. "Don't start making this about race." "I didn't," Malcolm said quietly. "You did, the moment you looked at me." The silence stretched again, heavier this time. The younger receptionist stared at her monitor, pretending not to hear. The bellhop avoided eye contact as he passed. Elliot, unmoved, gestured toward security. "Escort this gentleman out. He's disturbing the lobby." "Disturbing?" Malcolm echoed as two guards approached. "Because I asked to pay for a room? You've been warned. We're done here." Malcolm looked at the guards, one older, one younger, both clearly uncomfortable. He nodded once, calmly picked up his duffel, and turned toward the doors. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. And that silence, that unwavering restraint, echoed louder than any outburst could have. As the lobby door hissed open and the cold outside swept in, he walked through the threshold with the posture of a man taking mental photographs, filing names, faces, and words away, not for vengeance, but for clarity, because now the mask was off. And Malcolm King had seen exactly what hid behind the front desk of his own empire. The wind had picked up by the time Malcolm reached the sidewalk, tugging at the edge of his hood and brushing grit against his sneakers as the city moved past him in unconcerned rhythm. He walked slowly, not because he was unsure where to go, but because he was thinking, methodically, without emotion clouding the path, cataloging every detail of what had just occurred. The words, the expressions, the glances exchanged between staff, the way Elliot had never even considered checking the system. The arrogance hadn't been subtle. It had been weaponized, veiled in professionalism, sure, but so transparent to anyone who'd lived long enough to recognize it. He didn't hail a ride immediately. Instead, he walked for several blocks, past storefronts spilling warm light onto wet pavement, past honking taxis and couples hunched beneath umbrellas, letting the movement of the city work like solvent through his thoughts. Not long ago, he might have addressed this differently, called a meeting, demanded accountability, replaced the manager through channels. But that was the problem with distance. Distance diluted truth. Distance gave people like Elliot time to rewrite the story, to blur the edges of what had actually taken place. Not this time. By the time he reached his apartment, an upper-floor penthouse overlooking the river, quiet and still beneath the soft hum of recessed lights, he already knew what he would do. He shed the hoodie, hung the duffel by the door, and walked into his study, where the city glimmered through the glass behind his desk. He sat, opened his laptop, and pulled up the hotel's real-time availability portal. Not the public-facing version, but the one only owners and senior executives could access. Rooms available. Multiple. Just as he'd said. He leaned back, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and allowed himself one long, quiet breath. Then he began to plan. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the hotel again, but this time The man who stepped from the black car was not the one from the day before. Gone was the hoodie, the duffel, the casual anonymity. In their place, a slate-gray suit, tailored with absolute precision, silk tie in a muted oxblood that caught light only when it moved, and a coat so immaculately cut it seemed poured onto him. No briefcase, no entourage, just presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but absorbed it naturally. He didn't approach the desk immediately. Instead, he took a slow walk through the lobby, allowing his eyes to move without expression. The marble still gleamed. The chandeliers still glittered like winter stars. But the atmosphere, when seen through new eyes, seemed colder now, more brittle, polished, yes, but performative. The warmth in the architecture wasn't matched in the interactions. Near the seating area, he saw Elliot standing behind the desk, animated in conversation with a guest. She was tall, blonde, effortlessly composed in a white wool coat and $1,000 heels. The type the hospitality industry bent over backward to please. As Malcolm observed from a careful distance, Elliot laughed at something she said, leaning forward slightly with practiced charm, gesturing for the bellhop to assist her before she even had to ask. Moments later, another guest stepped forward. Mid-50s, red-faced, wearing a scarf printed with a luxury brand logo. Malcolm didn't recognize him, but Elliot clearly did. "Mr. Aldridge," he said with a smile that practically bowed. "It's good to see you again. The usual suite?" Aldridge nodded, tossing his coat over one shoulder without a word. "Absolutely," Elliot said, already typing. "We've kept it just how you like. Sparkling water chilled, and we upgraded your view this time. Let me know if there's anything else we can do to make your stay perfect." Malcolm waited until the interaction finished. Only then did he approach the desk, timing it precisely so Elliot would be the one to notice him first. He watched the manager's eyes flick up, then hesitate, registering the suit but not the face, which clearly hadn't made any lasting impression the day before. Malcolm didn't speak. He simply waited. "Good morning," Elliot said smoothly, as if on autopilot. "Welcome to King and Crest. How may I assist you today?" Malcolm offered a nod just short of courteous. "I'd like to book a room." "Of course." Elliot's fingers moved over the keyboard. "Efficient. Professional. Will this be for one night or multiple?" "One night. Room preference?" "Corner suite, if available." Elliot's eyes flicked toward the screen, but his voice changed subtly as he continued reading. "Yes, it looks like we're fully booked in our suites at the moment. The city is hosting a tech convention this weekend, and availability has been extremely tight." Malcolm waited a moment before speaking. "You're sure?" Elliot nodded, the same well-practiced smile from yesterday creeping back. "Completely full. I could perhaps check with one of our sister properties, but if you're hoping to stay here tonight, I'm afraid it won't be possible." Malcolm let silence answer him. He didn't blink. He didn't react. He simply watched. And in that moment, Elliot shifted. Subtle, but there. Something about the stare had pulled at the edge of memory, even if the full recognition hadn't landed. The manager blinked once, almost like a tick, and straightened his jacket. "May I ask, are you in town for the convention, Mr.?" "No," Malcolm said, his voice quiet. "Just passing through." "Ah." The pause stretched half a second too long. "Well, I do apologize for the inconvenience. If we had the availability, I'd be more than happy to assist you." Malcolm gave a polite smile that never touched his eyes. "Of course. Thank you for your time." He turned and walked away without another word. No scene. No confrontation. He left the hotel as smoothly as he had entered, steps calm, expression unreadable. But as he exited through the revolving doors and felt the cold press against his skin again, something had shifted. The test was done. The truth was confirmed. And now, it was time to act. The low, golden light of late afternoon filtered through the expansive windows of Malcolm's office, casting long shadows across the smooth walnut floor and the steel-framed artwork that lined the walls in sharp, angular contrast. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythm. Horns distant and steady, pedestrians weaving between taxis and buses, life unfolding in a measured current far below the stillness that had taken root inside. Malcolm stood at the window with one hand in his pocket, watching the horizon, while the other hand slowly rotated a glass of still water between his fingers. Not drinking from it, just letting the cool weight rest in his palm as his thoughts turned over with surgical clarity. Behind him, the soft shuffle of heels echoed across the floor as Carmen Reeves entered, tablet in hand, brow slightly furrowed in that way she often wore when she was already 5 steps ahead of what anyone else was about to say. Her hair was pulled back into a low twist, her blazer sharp enough to slice through tension, though today her eyes held a question rather than a command. "You asked for the personnel files," she said, voice low, efficient. "Manager at the Downtown Crest, Elliot Brandt. Been with us 4 years. Promoted to lead manager 18 months ago after transferring from the Boston location. Clean record, at least on paper. No formal complaints. 2 commendations for guest experience excellence." Malcolm turned, slowly walking toward his desk, the glass still untouched in his hand. No complaints. No red flags. Of course not. Carmen didn't respond right away. She watched him, studying the quiet edge in his voice, the stillness in his movements that only appeared when he was thinking 3 steps ahead. "You've seen something different." "I've seen what he does when he thinks no one's watching," Malcolm said softly, setting the glass down with a quiet click on the mahogany surface. "And I know that when people feel safe enough to condescend, that's when they're telling you the truth." Carmen sat across from him, fingers gliding across her screen. "You want to terminate?" "Eventually," Malcolm said, pacing behind his desk now, the movement slow but pulsing with thought. "But not yet, not while he still thinks he's in control. There's a kind of arrogance that doesn't learn when it's slapped. It only learns when it's surprised. When the floor drops out from beneath it." Carmen tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile forming, not from humor, but from recognition. "So, you want to give him the illusion of rising?" "I want him to walk into the lion's mouth thinking it's a banquet," Malcolm said, settling into his chair and folding his hands beneath his chin. "And I want every step there to feel like a reward." She tapped once, then looked up. "You want him here?" "I do. First thing Monday morning. Make it sound like an internal initiative, some new guest experience campaign. Tell him he's being considered for a regional training position, maybe even international expansion. That should flatter him enough to clear his schedule." Carmen nodded once. "I'll draft the invitation and copy it to his regional director so it looks official. Keep it vague, but warm. I want him walking in thinking it's the best day of his career." "And when he walks out?" she asked, no hesitation in her voice, only curiosity. Malcolm's smile was faint, more a shadow than a shape. "He'll walk out, wondering how it all went wrong. And for once, I won't need to raise my voice to make it right." Carmen stood, already pulling up calendar slots and executive meeting room availability as she moved toward the door. She paused, hand resting lightly against the frame. "For what it's worth," she said, glancing back, "I've worked with you a long time. I've never seen you let something like this play out so directly." Malcolm looked up, expression unreadable. "I've spent my entire career trying to create something that stood above that kind of ugliness. But yesterday, I realized that if I don't handle it myself, then the next man who walks through that lobby looking like I did might not get the choice. He'll just be told to leave." Carmen held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded and disappeared through the doorway, her heels clicking once more on the polished floor before silence returned. 2 miles across the city, in a modest office tucked behind the front desk of the hotel, he thought he ran with quiet superiority. Elliot Brandt was reading the email with a grin that barely contained itself. The message had arrived just moments before. A formal invitation to a private meeting at corporate headquarters with senior leadership. It was dressed in warm corporate language, full of phrases like leadership potential and guest strategy alignment and internal advancement dialogue. He read it twice, then a third time, his grin growing with each pass. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands behind his head as the satisfaction settled in deep, like a man who'd finally been seen. He didn't even pause to question why they hadn't called ahead or why no one had mentioned this opportunity before. It didn't matter. They were recognizing him. They were promoting him. And whatever face that man in the hoodie wore, it was long forgotten now. Unimportant, irrelevant, swept away like street dust before a red carpet. He clicked "accept" without hesitation, straightened his tie in the reflection of his monitor, and leaned back once more. As far as he was concerned, Monday was the beginning of his ascent, and he had no idea he'd already started falling. The conference room at King & Crest's corporate headquarters was all clean lines and silent authority. Tempered glass walls, brushed chrome fixtures, and a massive table of blackened oak that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A wall-mounted screen displayed the company's logo on an idle loop, and a tray of sparkling water and imported fruit sat untouched at the end of the table. A subtle nod to the brand's carefully curated luxury. Elliot Brandt arrived exactly 3 minutes early, dressed in his best charcoal gray suit, a fresh white pocket square folded just so. He adjusted his cuffs as he entered, eyes scanning the space with thinly veiled anticipation, the slight spring in his step betraying the story he'd already built in his head, that this meeting was his long-overdue recognition, the beginning of his ascent into the upper echelons of management. He was greeted not by a room full of executives, but by a single man seated at the far end of the table, thumbing through a folder with quiet focus. Malcolm King looked up slowly, offering a nod that was polite but unreadable. "Mr. Brandt," he said evenly, "thanks for coming in." Elliot hesitated, not out of recognition, but surprise. This wasn't what he'd expected. He had imagined a panel of VPs, perhaps a round of warm applause, a short slide deck outlining his new title. But instead, there was just this man, tall, poised, impeccably dressed, and someone Elliot couldn't quite place. Still, he recovered quickly, smiling as he approached the seat across from Malcolm and extended a hand with eager professionalism. "Thank you for having me, sir. I was honored to receive the invitation." Malcolm accepted the handshake, firm but brief, then gestured to the chair. "Please, have a seat." Elliot settled in, subtly adjusting his tie, scanning Malcolm's face for a flicker of recognition or warmth. None came. The man across from him remained composed, offering nothing but a patient, measured stare. "I understand you've been managing the downtown Crest for a little over a year and a half," Malcolm began, tone conversational, but precise. "How have you found the experience?" Elliot smiled, relaxing slightly. "It's been a privilege. Our clientele is discerning. The standards are high, but I pride myself on running a tight operation. We've improved margins and cut staff turnover significantly since I took over." "Impressive," Malcolm said with a nod. "And what would you say is the most important quality in your position?" "Consistency," Elliot answered quickly. "Our guests expect a certain experience. It has to be seamless, elegant, and safe. That means knowing who's walking through those doors, anticipating problems before they happen." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words carefully. "Let's test that instinct," he said. "Hypothetically, say a man walks into your lobby late afternoon. Well-dressed or not, no reservation, no assistant, no entourage, African-American, alone, wants to book a room. What's your move?" Elliot blinked, caught off guard. He chuckled softly, perhaps thinking this was part of a test or some managerial role-play exercise. "Well, I'd follow procedure, of course," he said smoothly. "Ask for ID, confirm method of payment, see what we have available. But, context matters. A lot of walk-ins tend to be looking for something other than a room, if you know what I mean. Malcolm did not smile. Enlighten me. Elliot cleared his throat, chuckling again, though it landed more awkwardly this time. Not trying to generalize or anything, just speaking from experience. Sometimes it's obvious when someone's not in the right place. The right place, Malcolm repeated slowly, letting the phrase stretch just enough to make it echo. Right, Elliot said, missing the weight behind the repetition. Look, you develop a sense for it. You know who's coming to spend money, who's coming to cause problems. It's about protecting the environment. We're not the kind of establishment where just anyone walks in off the street and gets a key. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together on the table. And what if you were wrong? Elliot blinked. Excuse me, if your assumption, Malcolm said, voice smooth as stone, was based on appearance, and if you dismissed someone, perhaps treated them with less courtesy, because they didn't meet your expectations for what a paying guest looks like, what happens then? Elliot shrugged. That's the job sometimes. You make judgment calls. You're not always going to be right. Malcolm's gaze didn't move. But what if that judgment was rooted in bias? There was a pause. A long one. Elliot shifted in his chair, sensing something beneath the surface, but still unable, or unwilling, to grasp it. I'm not racist, if that's what you're implying. I treat everyone the same. I don't believe that, Malcolm said, tone still calm but unmistakably harder now. Because people who treat everyone the same don't use words like those people when they think no one's listening. Elliot's face went still. The smile dropped completely now. Something flickered behind his eyes, a faint tremor of recognition, like a whisper returning through a closed door. Wait, he said slowly. Have we met before? Malcolm didn't answer. Not directly. He simply reached into the folder and removed a crisp photo. An angled still from the hotel's surveillance footage. A man in a navy hoodie, standing calmly at the front desk. Two guards approaching behind him. A manager, mid-gesture, expression cold and dismissive. Elliot stared at it for a long moment. Then his gaze lifted, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked at Malcolm with something closer to fear than confidence. You, he said softly. Malcolm set the photo down between them. I gave you 2 chances. Both times you failed. Not because of policy, not because of procedure, but because you made a decision the moment you saw me, and the way I looked didn't fit your idea of wealth. I didn't know, Elliot started, but Malcolm raised a hand. That's exactly the point, he said. You never even tried to. Elliot stared down at the photo on the conference table, the reflection of his own face frozen mid-dismissal, distorted slightly by the glossy surface beneath it. For a moment, he said nothing. His mouth opened once, as if to speak, but no sound followed. His eyes flicked back to Malcolm, and for the first time since walking into the room, something behind them shifted. Faint, but visible. Not recognition of the man across from him. Recognition of what he had done. Malcolm remained seated, his presence unmoving, his expression unreadable. The weight of the moment didn't need dramatics. It had settled into the walls like weather, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. I didn't realize, Elliot said finally, his voice smaller now, a careful blend of humility and practiced diplomacy. You weren't. I didn't know who you were. Malcolm didn't flinch. That's exactly the problem. I mean, Elliot continued quickly, you have to understand the position I'm in. There are all kinds of people coming in off the street every day. Some cause problems. Some pretend they're guests. Others try to scam their way into rooms. I've had to make judgment calls for years. It's not personal. It's policy. We have standards. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to make his words land with unmistakable clarity. I wasn't looking for a policy. I was testing a principle. Elliot offered a nervous chuckle, trying to find the right tone. Look, I understand how it looked, and clearly, in hindsight, it was a misread. But you weren't exactly dressed like a typical guest. We've all had to adapt to increased security concerns, and in that moment, I was thinking about safety. The guests, the experience. You were thinking about control, Malcolm said, voice calm but edged with steel. And you exercised it the moment I stepped through that door, because something in your mind told you I didn't belong. Not because of my behavior, not because of any threat, but because I didn't look like someone who could afford the floor beneath my feet. Elliot shifted in his chair, his palms beginning to sweat. You have to understand. People like us, in management, we're trained to respond to patterns, profiles. It wasn't about race. It always is, Malcolm said flatly, cutting through the excuse like a knife through paper. Even when you don't speak it aloud, even when it wears a name tag and a smile. Elliot opened his mouth again, but hesitated. For the first time, the contours of his confidence began to fade. His posture slouched slightly, and he dropped his eyes to the table, to the photo, as if searching for a detail that could undo the moment, a flaw in the image that might make it less damning. I didn't mean to offend you, he said finally, quieter now. I really didn't. You have to understand. I've worked hard for this job. I've run that location with nothing but loyalty to the company. Whatever happened that day, whatever you felt, it wasn't coming from malice. Maybe ignorance, maybe. Malcolm studied him in silence for a long moment, letting the words breathe in the still air before responding. Ignorance isn't an excuse when you're in charge. Elliot looked up again, a flicker of hope flashing behind his eyes. Look, if this is about correction, I'm willing to grow from this. Take a suspension, attend sensitivity training, make a public statement if you want. I just need to keep my position. I have responsibilities, a family. I've given years to this company. You gave those years to your ambition, Malcolm said, rising now, walking slowly toward the tall windows at the far end of the room. Not to the people, not to the values this brand was built on. You enforced a standard, but it was your own, not ours. The silence stretched once more as Elliot rose slowly, something desperate beginning to flicker in the back of his throat, though he tried to keep it disguised as poise. You're making a mistake, he said carefully. You don't have to do this. We could handle this quietly. Internally, you don't need the press getting wind of it. Doesn't help your image, doesn't help the hotel. We both lose. Malcolm turned then, slowly, arms crossed, gaze piercing. I didn't call you here to negotiate. So that's it? Elliot asked, a trace of bitterness finally creeping into his voice. You're firing me. Effective immediately, Malcolm said. You will receive formal notice by the end of the day. Your company email will be deactivated within the hour. Security will oversee your exit from the property. The words landed with the soft thud of finality, but Elliot remained frozen for a moment, as if the meaning hadn't fully taken root. Then, gradually, his expression began to harden, and something behind his eyes sharpened. Not confusion, not regret. Resistance. You're wrong about me, he said, voice lower now. You're seeing one moment and turning it into a character assassination. And let me tell you something. If you think I'm going to let you destroy my reputation with this overblown accusation, you don't know who you're dealing with. Malcolm said nothing. I've got options, Elliot continued, stepping forward now, his voice losing polish. You think I'll just accept this? You think you can fire me for something that wasn't even on record? You're dreaming. I'll take this to court. I'll tell the press. You've just painted a target on your back. And when this turns into a public fight, it won't be me they come after. It'll be you. And still, Malcolm said nothing. He simply returned to his seat, placed the folder neatly in front of him, and watched. Say something, Elliot said, louder now. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. I already did. Elliot's hands were no longer trembling. They were clenched at his sides, the blood rushing to his face faster than he could stop it. The corporate walls around him, once neutral and sleek, now felt suffocating, like glass traps closing in. The air was too still, the silence too complete, and across from him sat the one man who refused to flinch, who met every angry word with the kind of composed stillness that made Elliot feel suddenly, terrifyingly small. "You've made your decision," Elliot said, his voice no longer performative, no longer measured. The mask had cracked, and something sharper, more feral, bled through. "You've written your story. You walk in here pretending to be fair, pretending to be professional. But all you ever wanted was to embarrass me. You planned this. I didn't need to plan anything," Malcolm replied quietly, the words sliding beneath Elliot's anger like the undertow beneath shallow waves. "You wrote this ending yourself. You think I'm going to let you destroy my name over some self-righteous stunt? You think the board's going to stand behind this?" Elliot stepped forward now, pacing the edge of the conference table like a man trying to outrun his own reflection. "You may be the face of this company, but you're not untouchable. This is going to cost you." Malcolm remained seated, every movement deliberate, measured, grounded. "I'm not concerned with the cost. I'm concerned with the culture. And the culture we allow is the one we become. You taught every person under you that appearance decides value, that courtesy is conditional, that power excuses bias. And now you want to lecture me about what this is going to cost? You know damn well I didn't do anything other managers haven't done," Elliot said, snapping his fingers like the truth was something he could summon by force. "You think the luxury industry isn't built on discretion? On gatekeeping? You know how many managers I've seen turn people away for less than what I did? And they kept their jobs? They got promoted?" Malcolm's gaze didn't shift. "Then maybe they were lucky. Maybe they were invisible. But you weren't. You were seen." Elliot's laugh came bitter, breathless. "By who? Some guy in a hoodie playing undercover boss? By your staff. By your guests. By the cameras. And now, by me. You tricked me," Elliot snapped, his voice rising. "You walked in looking like, say it," Malcolm said, his voice like a blade unsheathed, cold and clean. "Say exactly what I looked like to you." Elliot flinched, but he didn't back down. "You didn't look like the kind of man who runs a hotel like that. And what does that man look like?" "You know exactly what I mean." "I do," Malcolm said, "but I want to hear you say it." Elliot's mouth tightened. His eyes darted to the folder still sitting on the table. The damning photo inside, the still image that had started the unraveling. He took a shaky breath, looked up, and then did the thing Malcolm had known he would do from the beginning. He turned the blame outward. "This is about you," Elliot said, jabbing a finger toward him now. "You've got something to prove. You think you can make an example of me? Parade this around like some kind of morality lesson? Like you're better than everyone else just because you clawed your way up from whatever neighborhood you crawled out of? But let me tell you something. You don't scare me. You never have." Malcolm stood slowly, not because he needed to match Elliot's energy, but because the moment called for gravity. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're right," he said. "I did claw my way up. I built this company room by room, guest by guest. And I did it while people like you looked at me the same way you looked at that man in the lobby. I didn't come from money. I didn't have a legacy. But I knew one thing. People remember how you treat them when no one's watching. And you, Mr. Brandt, have left a trail behind you too long to clean." Elliot stared at him, jaw locked tight, breath heaving just beneath the surface. "You're fired," Malcolm said again, this time not as a warning but as a conclusion. "Effective immediately. Leave your badge at the reception downstairs." "I'll burn this place down," Elliot muttered. "I swear to God." "No," Malcolm said calmly. "You won't, because you'll be too busy trying to pick up the pieces of your reputation." That was the last straw. Elliot's chair clattered back as he shoved it away, storming toward the glass door without so much as a glance behind him. He threw it open so hard it rebounded off the frame and nearly swung back into his shoulder. But he caught it with a trembling hand and disappeared into the corridor, footsteps thundering against the floor as he vanished from view. The room fell silent again. The folder sat untouched, and Malcolm, standing alone in the echo of what had just unfolded, slowly returned to his seat, letting the weight of it all settle in, not with regret, not even with satisfaction, but with the quiet confirmation that the line had been drawn, and this time he hadn't let it pass unseen. The door hadn't even finished swinging shut behind Elliot before the building felt quieter. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after an eruption, when the echo of rage still clings to the walls like smoke. Malcolm remained seated in the center of it, not moving, not speaking, simply resting his hands on the arms of his chair while the glass-walled conference room gradually stilled around him. His expression held no gloating, no trace of triumph, just confirmation, the kind that didn't need to be shouted, to be felt. He stayed that way for several minutes, breathing in the stillness, until Carmen entered the room with a tablet already in hand, her eyes meeting his without question. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. "Shall I notify legal?" she asked quietly. Malcolm nodded once. "And prepare a full report for the board. I want them briefed before the noise starts." Because noise, Malcolm knew, was coming, and it didn't take long. By nightfall, Elliot Brandt had done exactly what Malcolm expected him to do, turned the first microphone he could find into a platform, spinning the story with the desperation of a man trying to outrun truth itself. He wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for his image. And in his version of events, he wasn't a manager who had humiliated a black man at the front desk of the very hotel he managed. He was a loyal employee, blindsided and sacrificed for optics. The article appeared on a mid-tier news blog first, one of those publications that thrived on corporate scandals and high-traffic headlines. Fired hotel manager alleges discrimination by CEO after mysterious incident. The title alone was crafted with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to twist perception. The article quoted Elliot at length, his words defensive, measured in tone, but bitter in subtext. "I've given 4 years to this company. Never had a single complaint. I've trained staff, improved operations, delivered results. And now I'm being forced out with no due process, no chance to explain myself. It's clear I was targeted. I stood by our standards, and I was punished for it." Other outlets picked it up within hours. The echo chamber ignited. Social media joined in, half the voices demanding transparency from King and Crest, the other half dissecting the language of Elliot's statement like forensic analysts. Some called it racism in reverse. Others cried foul on a powerful CEO firing someone under mysterious circumstances. Most didn't know the facts. But in the early stages of any public story, facts rarely mattered more than outrage. Through it all, Malcolm said nothing. He didn't release a statement. He didn't give interviews. He didn't tweet or post or go live. Instead, he met with his legal team behind closed doors, reviewed the internal documentation, and prepared the company to respond not with noise, but with evidence. In private, his attorneys confirmed what he already suspected. "He's preparing a formal suit," the lead counsel said, sliding a printed draft across the table during their first strategy meeting. "Wrongful termination, retaliation, and racial discrimination. He's claiming he was dismissed due to a fabricated incident he was never allowed to defend." Malcolm didn't blink. "Let him file. There's enough internal support to shut this down before it becomes a full trial," the attorney offered carefully. "We can settle quietly. It won't make the papers. A non-disclosure, a severance check, and this goes away." Malcolm's gaze never left the draft. His fingers traced the edge of the paper like he was reading not the words, but the intention behind them. I'm not interested in silence. I'm interested in accountability. The room quieted. Then we'll proceed, the attorney said after a moment, and with that, the tone was set. Meanwhile, Elliot continued his public campaign. Within a week, he had retained an attorney known for aggressive media tactics, a man who specialized in leveraging corporate settlements by dragging private matters into very public courtrooms. The lawyer appeared on 2 cable news segments, repeating the same story. My client was targeted. This is what happens when companies care more about appearances than the people who built them. They framed it as a cautionary tale. The faithful worker cast aside for optics. The faceless CEO, too powerful to be questioned. But what they didn't understand, and what Malcolm knew with quiet certainty, was that he had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. And the truth, once shown, didn't need embellishment. Behind the scenes, his team had already begun compiling everything. Video footage, internal communications, guest statements, and testimony from staff members at the downtown location. It wasn't about building a case. The case had already been built. It was about showing the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed. Not in whispers, but in record. At the same time, Carmen was managing the company's external messaging with the precision of a surgeon. A single press statement was released. Brief, unshaken, and carefully neutral. King & Crest confirms the termination of a former employee following a thorough internal review. As a matter of policy, we do not comment on active legal matters. We remain committed to upholding the standards of excellence and equity our brand was built on. No accusations, no drama. Just the quiet assurance of a company that knew what it stood for. Malcolm read the final draft before it went out and gave a simple nod. He wasn't chasing the spotlight. He was waiting for the courtroom, because in court there would be no headlines, only evidence, and this time Elliot would be seen for exactly what he was, without the podium, without the microphone, and without a door left to storm through. Though the lawsuit loomed like a dark cloud over the brand's image, life within King & Crest continued moving, just not in the way it had before. In the weeks following Elliot's very public fall, the atmosphere inside the downtown hotel shifted in subtle but telling ways. There was no single moment when everything changed, no loud announcement or company-wide broadcast declaring a new era. But the difference was felt. In glances exchanged behind the front desk, in the way staff lowered their voices when guests complained, in how eyes lingered on the front door just a second longer before deciding whether to smile. The employees who had been present on the day Malcolm was turned away began to look back on it with sharper memory. For the receptionist who had hesitated when Elliot shut down Malcolm's booking request, the guilt had settled deep. She had played along, not because she agreed, but because she had learned the quiet lesson of survival. Don't challenge the manager, especially not in front of guests. And yet now, sitting in the break room weeks later, she realized that silence hadn't preserved anything. It had only enabled it. Others wrestled with more discomforting reflections. The bellhop who had walked past during the first incident had seen it unfold, but told himself it wasn't his place to intervene. He had assumed the man being escorted out must have done something. He'd trusted that Elliot knew what he was doing. Now, that certainty felt hollow. But perhaps the most pronounced change came in how leadership began to carry itself. With Elliot gone, an interim manager had been appointed by Malcolm himself. Not from another branch, not from outside the company, but from within. Her name was Lauren James, formerly the assistant manager, and unlike her predecessor, she didn't see herself as a gatekeeper. She saw herself as a guide. She had been present during both of Malcolm's visits, had watched in discomfort as Elliot dismissed him, had even tried to step forward once, but Elliot had shut her down with a look. She remembered the shame that had crawled up her throat when she stood still. So when the call came from corporate asking her to step into leadership, she didn't hesitate. Not because she felt ready, but because she knew what not stepping up looked like. Under Lauren's leadership, small policies began to shift. Not outwardly. There were no sweeping diversity training mandates or PR-driven campaigns. Instead, she started with conversations. One-on-one meetings with every department head. Quiet reviews of how frontline staff had been handling walk-ins. She asked about instinct, tone, body language. Things that didn't always make it into reports, but shaped every guest interaction. When guests walked in now, whether in designer coats or scuffed sneakers, they were greeted. Always. When someone approached the desk without a reservation, the staff checked first before responding, not because they feared another scandal, but because the culture itself was being rewritten from the inside. Slowly, quietly, permanently. Carmen visited the property 3 weeks into Lauren's tenure. She didn't arrive with fanfare or under executive title. She wore a soft beige blouse, flats, and no visible badge. She didn't announce who she was. She simply walked the floor, lingered near the elevators, watched the interactions, the rhythms, the hesitations that still lingered, but were less pronounced than before. Later, she met Lauren in the manager's office. The room had already changed. Where Elliot once kept walls bare and sterile, Lauren had placed small framed photos of staff gatherings, guest thank-you notes, and a vase of fresh lilies on the shelf behind her desk. "I didn't think you'd come in person," Lauren said, offering her a seat. "I wanted to see it," Carmen replied, sitting across from her. "See how the hotel breathes now." Lauren nodded, folding her hands. "It's still healing, but we're moving. You're doing more than that." There was a moment of stillness, mutual understanding passing between two women who had seen what happened when power was misused and what it took to quietly reclaim it. "He doesn't want revenge," Carmen added, her voice low. "Mr. King, that was never the point." "I know," Lauren said. "It's the only reason I said yes." Meanwhile, at headquarters, Malcolm continued working, not from behind layers of legal defense, but from the center of the company's values. He didn't attend public interviews, nor did he draft op-eds or rebuttals to Elliot's televised statements. What he did instead was pore over departmental reports, read employee surveys line by line, and request direct updates from every general manager in the chain. The goal wasn't optics, it was reform. He called in department heads not to reprimand them, but to ask questions. What does your hiring process prioritize? What criteria are being used to evaluate first impressions? How do we define excellence, visually or functionally? He wasn't trying to shame the company into change. He was trying to remind it who it had claimed to be from the beginning. And slowly, it responded. The hotel chain began piloting anonymous guest experience reviews conducted by individuals from varied socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. Real guests with real stories. Internal promotion structures were adjusted to factor in cultural intelligence alongside technical performance. Hiring panels were expanded to include diverse voices, not for compliance, but for balance. And the board, once passive in tone, now listened with deeper attention when Carmen presented quarterly breakdowns not just of profits, but of people. Who was rising, who was stalled, and why. Nothing about the changes was performative, and that was what made them permanent. The courtroom wasn't dramatic in design. No sweeping arches, no towering windows, no ornate seal looming overhead. It was, in fact, almost painfully plain. Pale walls, dull carpeting. A judge's bench elevated just enough to mark its authority, but not so high as to feel distant. And yet, as Elliot Brandt stepped into that room on the morning of his civil hearing, he moved as though walking onto a stage, his jaw set and shoulders squared with the stiff determination of a man still clinging to the story he had chosen to tell. He wore a dark suit, crisp and expensive, tailored to create the illusion of control. His tie was modest, his expression even more so. It was the face of a man misunderstood, not malicious. A loyal employee, publicly humiliated, now seeking justice. Or so he intended them to believe. His attorney, sharp-jawed and media-savvy, spoke confidently to reporters outside the courthouse, offering quotes crafted to strike a nerve. This is about fairness, about due process, about what happens when powerful men silence those who challenge them. Malcolm, in contrast, made no statements, gave no interviews, and didn't step near a camera. He arrived through a back entrance with his counsel and took his seat without ceremony. His presence, like always, was steady. Not stoic, not disengaged, but measured. He didn't need to perform. He just needed the truth to be seen. The opening arguments began the way such battles often do, with Elliot's attorney painting his client as a man caught in the gears of corporate hypocrisy. Mr. Brandt was terminated without warning, without a chance to respond, based on a misunderstanding intentionally exploited for personal optics, he said, gesturing toward the jury with a practiced sincerity. What happened at that hotel wasn't malice. It was miscommunication. And Mr. Brandt is not a villain. He is a casualty. Malcolm's team didn't interrupt. They didn't object. They let it land, let the air settle before rising in quiet contrast. When their lead attorney finally stood, she didn't raise her voice or invoke righteousness. She simply turned to the jury and said, "You will see the moment judgment replaced service. You will hear from employees who watched it happen, and you will learn that this wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern, hidden behind procedure." Then the footage began. The courtroom dimmed as the screen came to life, projecting the security video onto a mounted display. No commentary, no cuts. Just raw, unfiltered moments captured by the hotel's own system. Malcolm walking into the lobby, setting down his duffel, waiting patiently. Elliot approaching, unsmiling, posture rigid. The exchange, calm, measured, but curt. Then the dismissal, the refusal to check availability. And finally, the moment when two uniformed guards flanked Malcolm and escorted him out, even as he remained composed, offering no resistance. You could hear the silence in the room deepen with each frame. Then came the second video. Malcolm again, now in a tailored suit, his presence unmistakable. The same front desk, the same manager. A second attempt, a second denial. Elliot's expression just as firm, his tone just as final, insisting, again, that no rooms were available. The jury watched in silence. No one spoke. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, as if recalibrating his expectations in real time. Then came the testimonies. The receptionist, who had been on duty during both incidents, took the stand. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but strengthened as she continued. "I wanted to say something, both times, but he, Mr. Brandt, made it clear we weren't to contradict him in front of guests. And there was an unspoken rule about who we welcomed." Her words hung there, unanswered. The bellhop followed. It wasn't official policy, but it was understood. Certain guests you were encouraged to greet. Others you were told to watch. "What do you mean by watch?" Malcolm's lawyer asked. The bellhop hesitated, then answered carefully. "It meant you don't help. You don't offer. You observe." "And what did Mr. King do that day to warrant being watched?" "Nothing," the bellhop admitted, "except how he looked." By the time Elliot was called to testify, the jury had already heard enough to fill the gaps in his narrative. But still, his attorney pressed forward, painting Elliot as a man who had been following instinct, who had misread a situation, not out of bias, but from a place of professional caution. Elliot, for his part, tried to hold the line. "I didn't recognize him," he said. "I thought he might be, well, someone trying to loiter or maybe ask for assistance without being a guest. We get that sometimes. I acted on what I thought was a legitimate concern." "But you didn't check availability," the attorney pointed out. "No, you didn't ask for identification." "No." You made a judgment the moment you saw him. Elliot's jaw clenched. I made a decision based on experience. And, in your experience, what kind of guests typically don't belong? The pause was long. Elliot's eyes flicked to the jury. He didn't answer. In that silence, something shifted. Whatever doubt had been hovering in the room began to dissipate, not with a dramatic outburst, but with the slow, inescapable weight of clarity. By the time court recessed for the day, no one needed to be convinced of what they had seen. It wasn't about one man. It wasn't even about one mistake. It was about something deeper, something systemic. And now, with every word, with every minute of footage, it had a name. The final arguments had not yet been made, but the tide had turned. And Elliot Brandt, who had once believed he could control the narrative, was now standing in a room where the truth spoke louder than anything he could say. By the end of the second week, the courtroom no longer felt like neutral ground. It had become a crucible, hot with tension, thick with the presence of people who had come not just to witness the proceedings, but to measure what justice meant when one man's pride collided with another man's silence. Elliot arrived each morning dressed in the same tailored armor, but the crispness no longer carried authority. His posture sagged in places he hadn't noticed before, and his eyes, once alert and defiant, had dulled into something wearier. The narrative he had rehearsed so thoroughly, the misunderstood professional, the scapegoated manager, had begun to slip through his fingers like sand. No amount of polish could distract from the weight of the testimonies or the footage that had been replayed not once, but twice, each time more difficult to explain away. Worse, the media storm he had once controlled so confidently was beginning to turn against him. Early headlines had carried his version of events with enthusiasm, hungry for controversy. But now, new op-eds were surfacing, asking harder questions. Not about Malcolm King, but about the industry itself. About gatekeeping, coded policies, and the way people in power quietly decide who deserves dignity and who does not. The articles didn't name Elliot directly, but he could feel himself in every word. And though he'd tried to ignore the growing whispers in the press gallery, he couldn't help but notice how the cameras had started shifting their focus. Not on him, but toward the quiet man seated at the defense table. Malcolm had barely spoken. His presence remained steady, his expressions unreadable. He wasn't cold, but neither was he eager to react. When witnesses took the stand, he listened without flinching. When Elliot spoke, he never once interrupted. And in that stillness, something more powerful than outrage took shape. Malcolm didn't need to attack. The truth did it for him. On the third day of the final week, Carmen testified. She was calm, composed, every syllable delivered with clarity. She explained how Malcolm had personally reviewed the guest complaint reports, how he had chosen to visit the hotel alone, unannounced, without notifying the local staff or even his own internal advisors. She confirmed that he had approached the front desk with the full intention of being treated like any guest, and that he had returned the next day in formal wear to ensure the treatment was not a one-time mistake, but a pattern. Mr. King wasn't testing the staff, she said quietly. He was observing the company culture he had built, trying to see if it still reflected his values. And did it? The lawyer asked. She didn't hesitate, not that day. Elliot's attorney tried to press her, attempted to shift the narrative again, to paint Malcolm as a calculating executive seeking to orchestrate a public reckoning for personal satisfaction. But Carmen didn't bite. He didn't want this to become public, she said, her voice never rising. He only wanted accountability, and when it became clear that private correction wouldn't be accepted, he allowed the process to play out. That word, process, seemed to land heavier than most. By the time closing arguments approached, the courtroom felt like it had already begun to settle into a silent verdict. The judge remained measured, the jury unreadable. But the atmosphere had changed. It no longer pulsed with Elliot's righteous energy. It no longer revolved around the firestorm he had tried to stoke. Instead, it had settled into the rhythm of something deeper, slow, undeniable justice. Elliot's attorney delivered his final appeal with polish and volume, framing the trial as a lesson in humility, a cautionary tale about overcorrection and the dangers of allowing emotional retribution to cloud professional judgment. He spoke of Elliot's years of service, of spotless reports, of the right to make mistakes without losing everything. But his words no longer echoed the way they had at the start. There was something hollow in the way the jury watched him. Not hostile, just unconvinced. When it was the defense's turn, Malcolm's lead attorney didn't lecture. She didn't posture. She simply recounted what had already been seen. You've watched the footage. You've heard the staff. You've seen the way policies were interpreted, not as tools of service, but as weapons of exclusion. My client didn't fire Mr. Brandt because he made one bad call. He fired him because Mr. Brandt treated a paying guest like an intruder. Twice, based not on behavior, but on bias. That's not a mistake. That's a mindset. She paused before continuing, letting her next words settle deep into the quiet room. Mr. King didn't demand an apology. He didn't demand the spotlight. All he wanted was a culture that saw people, not profiles. A place where respect wasn't earned by appearances, but given by default. And when he didn't find that, he did what a leader should. He acted. There were no fireworks, no outbursts. Just the soft rustle of paper as she returned to her seat, and the gavel as the judge dismissed court for the day, stating that jury deliberations would begin in the morning. Elliot remained in his seat for a long moment after the room began to clear, his eyes locked on the desk in front of him, as though searching for an answer that refused to reveal itself. He had come to this trial to reclaim his name. But now, it felt like even the sound of it carried a different weight, as if each letter had been weathered by the truth. Malcolm, rising slowly, said nothing as he gathered his papers. He didn't look back as he stepped out of the courtroom, his stride steady, his shoulders relaxed. The confrontation was done. The decision would follow. And Elliot, once so certain of how this would end, now sat alone in the one place he never thought he'd be. Powerless. The morning the verdict was due, the courthouse felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, as though it had absorbed the weight of every argument, every silent judgment, every unspoken truth that had been hung in the room like a curtain no one dared touch. The gallery was full, but hushed, a low tension humming beneath each seat, every shuffle of fabric or clearing of a throat sounding louder than it should have. Outside, the press had multiplied. Cameras flashed against the courthouse steps. Anchormen rehearsed their talking points between takes. And Elliot Brandt, once confident in his ability to control the narrative, now kept his head down as he entered through the front, no longer hiding from the spotlight, but no longer comforted by it either. Cameras flashed against the courthouse steps. Anchormen rehearsed their talking points between takes. And Elliot Brandt, once confident in his ability to control the narrative, now kept his head down as he entered through the front, no longer hiding from the spotlight, but no longer comforted by it either. He wore the same dark suit, though it had begun to lose its sharpness. The fabric creased slightly at the shoulders, the collar just a bit too tight. The tie knot he'd once perfected now pressed against his throat like something meant to restrict rather than complete. His attorney walked beside him, still calm, still polished, still speaking in clipped reassurances that fell flat against the silence growing inside Elliot's chest. "They haven't deliberated long," the attorney whispered as they approached the defense table. "That usually means clarity. We've made our case. We've shown your record. We've highlighted the overreach. Whatever they decide, we're ready to appeal." Elliot nodded, but the words hardly registered. His eyes drifted across the room toward the rows of faces he no longer recognized, many of whom had once watched him in interviews or shaken his hand at conferences or nodded in agreement during management training seminars. Now they looked at him with something colder: detachment, the distance people put between themselves and someone falling. Malcolm sat quietly across the aisle, still and composed as ever. No notepad, no papers, just his hands resting on the table in front of him, his posture relaxed but upright, his gaze unfixed, as though he were not waiting for a verdict, but listening to something far beyond the room. He had said so little during the trial, had offered no defense more powerful than his own presence, and yet, somehow, he had become the eye of the entire storm. Still, centered, and impossible to ignore. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. The foreman holding a slip of paper as though it were made of glass. Malcolm's attorney leaned forward slightly. Elliot felt a bead of sweat crawl down the side of his neck and resisted the urge to wipe it. The judge nodded once. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The paper was handed over. The judge scanned it with a slow nod, then passed it back without expression. "Please read the verdict into the record." The foreman stood. He was a tall man, late 50s, quiet through the entire process, never once reacting during testimony. His voice now was steady, but clipped, like someone delivering a truth too heavy for flourish. "In the matter of Brandt vs. King and Crest Hospitality Group," he began, "we, the jury, find in favor of the defendant." The room didn't erupt. There were no gasps or outbursts, no cries of victory or muttered curses, just silence, complete and absolute, broken only by the soft creak of Elliot leaning back against his chair, as though something had struck him in the chest, not all at once, but slowly, like a vice tightening breath by breath. The foreman continued, "We further find that the termination of the plaintiff was justified and not motivated by discrimination or retaliatory action. Damages sought are denied in full." The judge thanked the jury. Court was adjourned, and still Elliot did not move. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, leaned in with whispered words that Elliot couldn't hear. His mind had begun to fracture into fragments, images, voices, memories flashing in and out of focus. The day Malcolm walked into the lobby, that voice calmly asking for a room, the way Elliot had smiled, tight, dismissive, condescending without even knowing he'd done it. The second visit, the tailored suit, the polite insistence that something was off. And then, the final meeting, that cold glass conference room where Malcolm had let him talk, let him lie, let him rage, before ending it all with the truth. Across the aisle, Malcolm stood, offering no visible reaction, no nod, no expression of satisfaction. Just a brief glance toward the jury, then toward Carmen, who gave the subtlest tilt of her head before collecting their things. They didn't linger. They didn't gloat. They simply exited the room, like the verdict had only confirmed what they already knew. Elliot remained seated long after the room had emptied, the bench beside him growing colder with every passing minute. His attorney excused himself to take a call, murmuring something about next steps, public statements, damage control. But Elliot barely heard him. He stared down at his folded hands, the skin now pale beneath the fluorescent lighting, the fingers clenched so tightly they left shallow impressions in his palms. He had come to this trial believing he could still win. That image would save him. That years of spotless reports and polished smiles would prove more powerful than one man's experience. But now, as the weight of the verdict settled across his shoulders, heavier than any uniform he'd ever worn, he began to understand what he had truly lost. It wasn't the job, it wasn't the lawsuit, it was the illusion. He was no longer the voice of authority. He was the cautionary tale. 3 days after the verdict, Malcolm stood alone in the studio at King and Crest's corporate headquarters. The lights were warm, but unobtrusive. The set minimal. No flags, no branding behind him, just a single chair before a soft gray backdrop and a camera lens that waited without judgment. Carmen sat just beyond the frame with a tablet in her lap, reviewing the last edits of the internal rollout plan. There would be no press release, no television appearance. This wasn't for the media, it was for them. For the doormen and the bellhops, for the front desk clerks and housekeeping managers, for the concierge team who fielded impossible requests with effortless grace, and especially for the ones who had stayed silent, whether out of fear, complicity, or conditioning. Malcolm didn't rehearse. He didn't need a script. He adjusted his jacket once, nodded to the technician behind the glass, and waited for the red light to glow steady on the lens. Then he began. "My name," he said, voice low and steady, "is Malcolm King. Most of you know me as the CEO of King & Crest. Some of you have worked for this company for years. Some of you are new. And many of you, until recently, didn't know who I was. That's not an accident. I've never been interested in walking through our properties just to be applauded or recognized. I built this company not to be seen, but to serve." He paused, not to create drama, but to let the words breathe. "A few weeks ago, I visited one of our flagship hotels. Not as your CEO, not in a suit, not behind a desk. I walked in alone, dressed like any other guest might, without an assistant, without an entourage, without fanfare. And what I encountered there forced me to reckon with a truth I have known all my life, but had hoped we had risen beyond. How quickly perception turns into policy when prejudice is left unchecked." His eyes didn't flinch from the camera, and his voice remained calm. Not theatrical, not softened. Just truth. I was profiled. Twice. Not for my behavior, not for anything I said, but for how I looked. I was assumed to be less. I was treated as a nuisance, not a guest. And when I returned the next day in a tailored suit, I was still turned away, not because there were no rooms, but because there was no willingness to see past the surface. He folded his hands, leaning slightly forward, his gaze sharpening. "That manager is no longer with us. As many of you already know, he filed a lawsuit. The court ruled in our favor. But this isn't about one man. This isn't about a trial. It's about who we are, and who we refuse to be." There was no bitterness in his tone, only conviction. "Let me be clear. King & Crest does not and will not tolerate racism. Not in whispers, not in actions, not in assumptions disguised as standards. If you are in any position of authority, and you believe your job gives you the right to decide who belongs based on race, class, or appearance, then let me save you the trouble. We will find you. And we will remove you." The silence between his sentences was no longer just for pacing. It was reverent now, charged with meaning. Hospitality is not about power. It is about service. And service does not pick and choose who deserves kindness. Service does not discriminate in marble lobbies or penthouse suites. Service means dignity. It means accountability. And it means that every guest, whether they arrive in a town car or on foot, deserves to be seen. Carmen watched from behind the monitor, her jaw set, her fingers still. She knew this wasn't just a speech. This was the real beginning of everything they had been working toward. The performance was over. The promise was beginning. "I know many of you would never dream of treating someone this way," Malcolm continued. "But this isn't about guilt. It's about culture. It's about what we accept, what we ignore, what we allow to happen in the name of efficiency or silence or fear. And I'm telling you now, that era is over." He didn't blink. His voice didn't rise. And still, somehow, every syllable rang louder than the verdict itself. "We are reviewing every location. We are speaking with every manager. We are opening up anonymous reporting channels so that no one has to wonder if they'll be punished for doing what's right. And if you have been mistreated, overlooked, or made to feel less than, I want you to know, your voice matters. We are listening, and we are acting." The technician behind the camera gave him a small signal. They had reached the end of the timed segment. Malcolm nodded once, but didn't move to leave. He had one more thing to say. "I built this company from nothing. Not with connections, not with legacy wealth, but with belief. I believed that we could create something better. And I still do. But belief is not enough. It must be protected, lived, defended." He leaned back in the chair, voice softening, but not in weakness, in strength. "We will be better. Starting now." Then, only then, did the red light go dark, and with it, any doubt about what came next. The morning air outside the downtown hotel was crisp, touched with the cool breath of early spring, the kind that carried a faint trace of blooming magnolias mixed with concrete and car exhaust. The building stood, as it always had, modern glass, sculpted stone, the king and crest glinting softly in the sunlight above the entrance. But something in its posture felt different now, less posed, less guarded, like a place that had taken a long breath after holding it too long. Malcolm stepped out of the car without ceremony. No assistant waited for him. No team trailed behind him. He wore no suit, no tie, just a dark wool coat over a gray sweater, slacks that fit with quiet precision, and shoes polished not for shine, but for readiness. He moved at an even pace toward the lobby, not scanning the windows, not watching for who would greet him. He had walked through this doorway before, twice, under very different circumstances. This time, he didn't need to play a role. This time, he was simply returning to a place that now knew who he was. The doorman nodded, stepping forward instinctively, hand hovering near the handle. But Malcolm reached for it himself, not dismissively, but deliberately. A small gesture. A reminder. He stepped into the lobby, letting the warm light and soft ambient piano music wrap around him. The marble still gleamed. The chandelier still cast broken gold across the floor, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no redesign could achieve. There was awareness now, a deeper quiet beneath the elegance. It no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a place where people worked and watched and learned. The front desk staff stood with the practiced poise of professionals, but Malcolm could see it in their eyes, the flicker of recognition, not just of his face, but of the message he had sent out across every hotel screen 3 days prior. The speech had been viewed more times internally than any corporate address in the company's history. Not everyone agreed with it. Not everyone applauded. But no one misunderstood it. From the left, Lauren James stepped forward, her stride smooth, her presence grounded in the same quiet strength that had earned her that manager's badge still pinned to her lapel. She extended her hand, not hesitantly, but with calm pride. "Welcome back, Mr. King," she said. "Good to be back," he replied, accepting the handshake, firm and steady. "We've made a few changes since your last visit, I've noticed." She smiled faintly, then added, "You're early. The staff briefing's in 20 minutes. Would you like to wait in the lounge?" "No," he said, glancing around the lobby. "I'd like to walk." She nodded and didn't follow. Malcolm made his way through the space without needing direction. He paused near the concierge desk, where a young man was helping an older couple sort out dinner reservations. The concierge, no more than 23, wore his uniform like it meant something. And when he caught Malcolm's eye, there was no panic, no scrambling, just a brief nod of acknowledgement and a return to his task. That was what Malcolm wanted to see. Not fear, not fuss. He passed the elevators, the gift shop, the lounge where he had once seen guests glance at him with wary confusion. Now they looked up only briefly, then returned to their conversations, their screens, their drinks. Not because they didn't recognize him, but because they didn't feel the need to question his place here. In the hallway beyond the main floor, he found the employee bulletin board, still full of schedules, announcements, And now, framed in the center, a printed transcript of his video address. Not laminated, not framed in gold, just paper, slightly curled at the corners. But read, highlighted in places, marked with initials where employees had left quiet signatures of agreement. When he returned to the staff conference room, they were already gathered. Front desk, bell staff, housekeeping supervisors, kitchen leads. Not a full company meeting, just the local team. Lauren introduced him, but there was no applause, and he hadn't asked for any. He stood at the front of the room without a podium, without notes, and let the silence settle before he spoke. "I didn't come here to congratulate you," he began, "not because you haven't earned it. You have. You've weathered a storm that never should have existed, and you've done it with grace." He looked at them, row by row, not scanning but seeing. "I came here to remind you that culture isn't built in press conferences. It's built in moments. It's built in the 10 seconds it takes to decide whether you welcome someone or ignore them, whether you protect a guest or protect your own comfort, whether you speak up or stay silent." Some heads nodded. Others simply listened. "We've made progress," he continued. "But progress isn't a destination. It's a discipline. And it's one we're going to uphold, together. Because this brand, this place, isn't about marble floors or rooftop lounges. It's about people. And people are watching." He let the final words settle. Not as a warning, but as a promise. When the meeting ended, he didn't linger. He shook hands. He thanked them. Then he returned to the lobby and made his way toward the exit, not flanked by cameras or staff, not surrounded by ceremony, but walking alone. This time, when he reached the front doors, the doorman opened them, not out of obligation, out of respect, and Malcolm stepped back into the sunlight, not as a man under cover, not as a man seeking answers, but as a man who had finally been seen. Not because of what he wore, but because of what he stood for. The work would continue, the mission would grow, and the suit would no longer be the only way to be recognized. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.